It's no secret that the PlayStation brand itself is huge today, with the PlayStation 4 currently standing as the home console market leader, likely set to even pass the overall current generation market leader in Nintendo 3DS within a year or two. But there was a time when the PlayStation brand and Nintendo were synonymous. Sony and Nintendo actually had a contract where Sony was going to release a CD add-on to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and this add-on, if successful, would have signified a longer mutual partnership for both companies. However, we know that never released publicly. Nintendo broke off from the partnership to team with Philips, and Sony launched their own platform called the PlayStation. As they say, the rest is history. What if Sony and Nintendo actually stuck together with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System CD-ROM system? This is our What If series, where we look at gaming history and ask ourselves, what if something went differently? These scenarios are based on actual events that were set up to go in a certain direction, but for various reasons never actually happened. This series is speculative, based on our own variant opinions. Given these alternate realities don't exist, we can only guess at what the landscape would look like today if these situations had occurred. So, what does happen if Sony and Nintendo kept their partnership and released the SNES CD-ROM system? Well, first, let's dive into a little history behind the partnership. Ken Kutaragi was a Sony engineer who wanted to work in the video game realm after seeing his daughter play games on the Famicom. He turned this into a contract with Sony, whereby he was instructed to develop hardware that would drive the audio subsystem of Nintendo's next console, the Super Famicom. While doing this, he secretly developed the Sony SPC 700, which is a sound chip that ended up being used in the Super Famicom. Before that happened, however, Sony ended up not being interested in the video game business at all, and his superiors did not approve of the project. This all changed when Sony executive Nori Oga thought it was a good idea and urged him to continue the project. This ultimately led to a partnership with Nintendo and Sony to develop a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Famicom and a Sony-branded console that would play both SNES games as well as titles released in the new SNES CD format. Obviously, this is how the sound chip technology found its way into the final build of the Super Famicom. Development of the new format started in 1988, and in 1991, Sony introduced a standalone console at the Consumer Electronics Show and dubbed it the PlayStation, 2 words. It could play current SNES games as well as the new disc format. However, things fell apart from there. Under the agreement they had, Sony would develop and retain control over the SNES CD format, with Nintendo effectively conceding a large amount of the control of the software and licensing to Sony themselves. This was a huge point of dispute for Nintendo, who sent their own team to Europe to negotiate a favorable contract with Philips, a huge rival to Sony at the time. A day after Sony unveiled the PlayStation, Nintendo and Philips introduced their partnership, surprising Sony, who still had a contract with Nintendo. After Nintendo played their hand, Sony and Nintendo did try to work out the differences. They ended up restructuring their contract in 1992, giving Sony the ability to create SNES-compatible hardware, but Nintendo would retain control over the profits on all software. New games even began development for this new combo system at the time, and there were over 200 different prototypes. However, things were still tepid between the two companies, and just 1 year later, Sony decided to develop their own console, where they would hold complete control. It's always hard to know who is at fault for the falling out, because you can understand why Nintendo would still want favorable licensing terms, and it's understandable that Sony, in turn, would want more than just some profit off of the sale of a consumer device, even though that was technically the business that they were in consumer electronics. You can understand both sides of the coin here, But ultimately, I want to look at a scenario where both companies worked it out and stayed united on the future of gaming. This is a world where the term PlayStation may never have existed as a brand, or if it did, it would be under a more united front. Probably known as the Nintendo PlayStation. Well, I don't think a venture where the SNES CD-ROM itself would have been a sales success for either company. I think had the partnership stood, Nintendo themselves would have seen some advantages to the disc format, trusting Sony to work more closely with Nintendo's own hardware team to release what would eventually become the Nintendo 64, or even just the Nintendo PlayStation. While this would mean the original PlayStation may not exist, we would now be looking at a system that may have been much the same as we know and love today, but it would have played discs instead. It's also possible Sony may have been able to talk Nintendo out of the three-prong controller. I don't think dual-stick gaming would have existed yet, but I do think Nintendo would have taken off like gangbusters in this situation. Let's consider what really happened. The PlayStation 1 and 2 showed third-party companies that a better, cheaper alternative to game cartridges and Nintendo's harsh policies at the time when Nintendo's chief competition was Sega, who time and again kept dropping the ball after the Genesis. So, to be fair, the Dreamcast was actually a brilliant system too, but it was too little too late to save Sega. With the PlayStation no longer being its own brand, there is a high potential here that Sony and Nintendo together, with a combination of the best features of the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 2, would have owned the video game market in a way we have never seen before. 150 million plus PlayStation 2s sold, we could be looking at 200 million in sales or more. This is a market where Sega would still have struggled, and Nintendo and Sony would have ensured complete market dominance on the home console front, and really handheld front as well, because there wasn't any competition there after the Game Gear fell off. It's likely Microsoft would have still jumped into the console space itself years later, because partnering with Nintendo and Sony would have been a near impossibility to please all parties involved. And with Sega out of the mix and the PlayStation brand no longer a thing, it's possible to think Microsoft may own more of the console market today in 2017 than they presently do, because they would have probably been more progressive than Sony and Nintendo in the online space. I don't foresee that changing in this scenario. The difference is, today in 2017, we likely would have never seen the Wii or the Wii U era. We would have never seen the Switch, and it's possible the innovation aspects of Nintendo's strategy would have been tied directly to add-ons and the handheld space. What is also clear, however, is that even with a more successful Xbox business, Sony and Nintendo today in 2017 would likely still be the combined market leaders, with the full backing of all third parties and all of Japan behind them. This would have been just as profitable overall as what the reality is today for both companies. Or maybe not. We don't really know. But there certainly would not have been as big of a divide in the video game community as there is today. Now, this is just all my humble opinion. What do you think would have happened? Of course, this is a really interesting scenario that we don't, there's a lot of speculation. We don't know what would have happened. But if the PlayStation never existed and Sony and Nintendo continued to work together, it's very interesting to see where the industry would have went. Anyways, I am Nathaniel Rufflejans from Nintendo Prime. If you like this video, you know what to do. If you dislike this video, hit that dislike button. Subscribe for more, and hey, let me know what you think about my ideas behind this, or what your ideas are down in the comments below. And as always, folks, I will catch you in the next one.